Ladies and gentlemen, today we confront a profound truth. No one will love you until you understand this. At first glance it might sound harsh, but it is the very key to emancipation. To understand this is to turn inward, to face the dark recesses of your own being, what I have termed the shadow. It is the part of your psyche you deny or repress shall be projected onto others. Until you acknowledge and integrate your shadow, your impulses, your fears, your faults, love remains elusive, for you cannot give what you have not accepted. This journey toward integration is the process of individuation, becoming whole. Individuation is not a luxury, it is essential. Only when you stand in yourself, balanced between your conscious persona and the unseen unconscious, can you become a vessel in which love may flow to yourself and to others. For too long we search outside, long for validation, affection, recognition, projecting our unmet needs onto partners, friends, society, but these projections inevitably collapse in the face of reality. Love free of heavy expectations becomes rare. My friends, love that lasts begins within. It begins when the self emerges, not the ego, but the underlying self, grounded, aware, and loving. So understand this. You are undeserving of rejection only when you know who you are, not who you imagine yourself to be. When you have met your inner darkness, you also realize your light, and this authenticity draws others not to a mask, but to a soul. Before love can truly blossom, one must descend into the underworld of their own soul. For until one embraces the darkness within, the light of love cannot pierce. There exists within each of us a silent, hidden presence, a constellation of impulses, fears, and disowned emotions that we avoid at all costs. This inner presence, elusive and often unsettling, is not foreign to who we are. It is us, only unacknowledged, and the tragedy of modern man is that he mistakes the denial of this presence for morality, and its confrontation for madness. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. What we reject in ourselves becomes the very force that governs our lives from the shadows. Most people are not fully aware of the extent to which they are divided within. They wear masks, not out of deceit, but out of survival. These masks or personas become the acceptable faces we show the world, but beneath them lies a complex web of unlived potential, repressed instinct, and unintegrated emotion. That which is hidden festers, grows, and eventually demands to be seen, either in the form of suffering, conflict, or projection onto others. One may live an outwardly decent life, admired and even loved, yet be a stranger to their own inner reality. And in this estrangement lies the seed of despair. The parts of ourselves we disown do not simply vanish, they retreat into the unconscious and wait. They wait for moments of vulnerability, for dreams, for conflict, for silence any window through which they might speak. And when they do not ask for destruction, they ask to be recognized. They seek not domination, but dialogue. The rage, the envy, the self, hatred, the desire for power, the lust for destruction, these are not signs of a broken soul, but cries for integration. Without this integration, one is only half alive. True self, understanding demands that we confront these shadow aspects, not with judgment, but with curiosity and courage. It is not enough to aspire to goodness. One must be whole. Wholeness does not mean purity or perfection. It means inclusion. The dark is as necessary as the light. Until one is willing to accept the entire truth of their being, love remains shallow, distorted by fear and illusion. Many people confuse love with approval. They wish to be loved only for the pleasant, the beautiful, the socially acceptable facets of themselves. But this kind of love is brittle. It fractures under pressure because it is based on illusion. Authentic love, whether from others or from oneself, can only exist when the totality of the person is brought into the light. To be loved in fragments is to remain unknown, and what is not known is not truly loved. The acceptance of the shadow is not an act of indulgence. It is a moral and psychological necessity. Without it, the inner war continues and we remain divided. But when we acknowledge these rejected parts, something remarkable happens. We are no longer enslaved by them. What was once compulsive becomes conscious. What was feared becomes familiar, and what was projected outward returns home. This is the beginning of freedom, for when the shadow is integrated, we stop seeing enemies everywhere. We stop needing to control the world to manage our inner chaos. We gain a groundedness that cannot be shaken by praise or rejection, because it is rooted in something deeper than performance or social approval. It is rooted in truth. To accept the shadow is not to become dark. It is to become whole. Light, after all, has no meaning without its contrast. Only in the tension between opposites does real transformation occur. The path is not easy. It demands humility, introspection, and a willingness to suffer the reality of who we are. But the reward is not merely psychological health. It is the possibility of real love. When we know ourselves, not in fantasy but in fact, we become capable of loving and being loved without deception. We can meet others without masks, without the desperate hunger for affirmation, because we are no longer hiding from ourselves. And then, perhaps for the first time, we encounter something real. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the doorway. Those who dare to walk through it do not become perfect, they become human. And in their humanity, they find what they were seeking all along, not the approval of the world, but the peace of being whole. There is no greater journey than the one that leads a man inward, into the deep and unmapped territories of his own soul. To live unconsciously, drifting along the surface of life, is the norm for most. They believe they are themselves, yet what they call the self is merely a bundle of inherited roles, cultural instructions, and egoic images. They mistake conformity for authenticity and routine for meaning. But somewhere, often quietly and without warning, a disturbance arises, a subtle unrest that cannot be silenced by distraction or achievement. It is the call toward what is real. This call is not to become someone new, but to recover what was lost. It is to return to the center, to recognize the many faces within, and to bring them into alignment. The process is not of addition, but of revelation. One does not become whole by striving for a higher self, but by uncovering the total self that was always there, obscured by layers of unconscious conditioning. The work is not to create the self, but to encounter it. Yet this encounter does not come without sacrifice. It demands the gradual death of illusions, the painful disillusionment with who we thought we were. What dies, however, is not truth, but falsehood, and as the masks fall away, a deeper identity begins to stir beneath the surface, an identity not built upon opinion or applause, but upon inner necessity. This movement toward inner unity unfolds not in linear time, but through crisis, symbol, dream, and reflection. One begins to recognize the many opposites that reside within the rational and the instinctive, the masculine and the feminine, the civilized and the wild. Rather than being enemies, these opposites are parts of the same whole. To become oneself truly and deeply, one must hold these tensions within, without denial or collapse. The goal is not to become one side or the other, but to become the vessel through which both may exist. And this is not a path for the faint of heart. The world will always offer easier paths of imitation, conformity, or blind ambition, but these roads lead outward, away from the center. To take the inward road is to risk misunderstanding, solitude, even suffering. For as one separates from the collective persona, one is no longer shielded by its false comforts. Yet what is gained in return is a clarity of being that no external reward can provide. To understand oneself is not a momentary insight, but a lifelong unfolding. It is a slow and sometimes painful integration of the fragments that live within. There are parts of us long abandoned, inner children who were silenced, inner warriors who were shamed, inner artists who were mocked. These aspects do not disappear, they remain hidden, waiting to be called back into the circle of the self. To ignore them is to remain divided, but to welcome them is to reclaim life in its fullness. And what emerges from this process is not a perfect person, but an authentic one. The authentic individual is not free from flaws, but he is free from falseness. He does not pretend to be what he is not, nor does he suppress what he truly is. He carries his contradictions with grace, aware that they are the very conditions of his humanity. In this way he becomes trustworthy, not because he is infallible, but because he is real. This inner alignment gives rise to something rare, a center that holds. When the storms of life come, as they always do, the one who knows himself does not shatter. He bends, but he does not break. He suffers, but he does not lose himself in the suffering, for he is rooted not in the external, which changes and fades, but in the internal, which remains. To walk this path is to become gradually more transparent to oneself. It is to live in increasing awareness, guided not by impulse or imitation, but by inner truth. And in this deepening of self-understanding, a strange and beautiful thing occurs. One begins to see others more clearly as well. For the more one accepts the whole of oneself, the more one can embrace the humanity of others. Judgment gives way to compassion, superiority dissolves into empathy. What we call growth is not expansion outward, but descent inward. It is not more knowledge, but deeper knowing, and at the heart of it all is the mysterious fact that the one we were searching for, the self we longed to become, was never absent. It was simply waiting, patient and still, for us to return. The mind has a peculiar way of seeing what it cannot tolerate within itself. It casts outward the very contents it refuses to accept, painting the world in the colors of its own unconscious. This is not done with awareness nor with malice. It is simply the mechanism by which the psyche protects itself from the unbearable weight of its inner contradictions. And so, people wander through life convinced that the enemy lies outside, that the fault belongs to others, that the world is unjust, hostile, or cruel, when in truth they are at war with themselves. This phenomenon, subtle yet pervasive, is known not through theory but through experience. One becomes irritated by the arrogance of another, blind to the same seed within. One condemns dishonesty in others, unaware of the mask they themselves wear. One longs for admiration while denying their own sense of inferiority. This projection is not a flaw in reason, but an expression of disconnection from the deeper, grounded self that no longer needs to distort reality to survive it. What is not made conscious is lived as fate. A man who cannot face his own inner aggression will find the world filled with persecutors. A woman who has repressed her capacity for independence will see others as controlling. These experiences feel real because they are, but they are not whole. They are real in the sense that the psyche is speaking through them, begging to be heard, but they are not grounded in the full truth of the outer world. They are colored, shaped, and intensified by the energies within. Only when a person begins to turn inward, slowly, courageously, does the veil begin to lift. The other is no longer a mirror of blame, but a mirror of revelation. And this is where the inner grounding begins, not in self-justification, not in moral superiority, but in the quiet humility of self-recognition. The person begins to see that what he hates in another may be unlived in himself, that what she loves in others may be a reflection of her own buried potential. The world becomes less of a battlefield and more of a symbolic landscape. To be grounded inwardly means to reclaim the power we unconsciously give away through projection. It means no longer depending on others to carry the burden of our own emotional life. It is not about becoming indifferent to the outer world, but about seeing it clearly, without the haze of unmet needs and unresolved wounds. This clarity is not cold, it is deeply human. It is the clarity of a person who is no longer reactive, but responsive, who no longer seeks saviors or scapegoats, but meets life as it is. This inner grounding requires solitude. It requires listening to the whispers that surface when the noise of distraction fades. It requires the painful honesty of admitting that the conflicts in our lives are not simply accidents, but reflections. And it requires the patience to sit with discomfort, rather than fleeing into judgment or fantasy. In doing so, one begins to gather themselves back from the many places they have scattered. But the work does not end with recognition. Once the projection is withdrawn, the real task begins: integration. What was once rejected must now be related to the inner tyrant, the inner child, the inner seducer, the inner coward. These are not enemies to be banished, but aspects to be understood. Only through relationship with these parts can one find balance, for without them the personality remains flat, brittle, one-sided, and what is one-sided is always vulnerable to collapse. The reward of this grounding is profound. One no longer walks through the world seeking constant affirmation, nor fearing every criticism. The opinions of others lose their tyrannical hold, not because they no longer matter, but because they no longer define. The center has shifted from the external to the internal, and in that center one finds something immovable, a sense of self that is not constructed, but discovered. When a person reaches this state, relationships transform. Love becomes possible without possession, conflict becomes bearable without destruction, difference no longer threatens because the self is no longer fragmented. One can stand in themselves, open yet contained, connected yet free. In the end, the world is not as we see it, it is as we are. To see clearly, one must first see within. Only then does the projection cease, and in its absence we find not emptiness, but presence, not illusion, but reality. Not separation, but wholeness. Love is not something that is found, acquired, or earned through the approval of others. It is not a currency to be traded, nor a reward for obedience. It is, at its deepest level, a movement from the center of one's own being, a quiet radiance that emanates not because of what one does, but because of what one is. The tragedy, however, is that most seek love outwardly, chasing reflections, hoping to be completed by another, unaware that what they truly long for can only arise from within. At the root of this confusion is a fundamental misunderstanding of the self. Most people live in identification with the ego, the surface personality shaped by upbringing, culture, and personal history. This ego seeks recognition, power, pleasure, and validation. It loves not for the sake of the other, but for the reflection it receives in their eyes. When it is admired, it feels strong. When it is ignored, it collapses. But this is not love. It is dependence dressed in affection, insecurity masked as intimacy. The true source of love lies far beneath this fragile identity. It belongs to a deeper center, one that is not defined by achievement or social mask. This center does not shout, it whispers. It does not seek possession, but connection. When one makes contact with this inner ground, what might be called the self, something changes. The hunger for external approval begins to fade, not because love is no longer desired, but because it has been discovered where it had always been, within. To encounter this inner source is not to become isolated or indifferent. On the contrary, it is to become more deeply related, to oneself, to others, to life, but the quality of the relation changes. It is no longer about merging with the other in desperate longing, nor about clinging in fear of abandonment. It becomes a meeting of wholeness. Two complete beings, rooted in themselves, can meet in love without needing to devour or dominate. But to reach this inner source, one must descend into themselves. The journey is not upward toward ideals, but inward toward essence. It is not achieved through perfection, but through integration, bringing into harmony the many scattered parts of the psyche. One must face the wounds, the fears, the unloved aspects of the self. For how can one offer love to another when they have not yet offered it to themselves? This inner work is not selfish. It is, in fact, the foundation for any real capacity to love. A person who is at war with themselves cannot offer peace. A person who hates aspects of their own soul will inevitably reject those same aspects in others. What is unloved within will be condemned without. This is why the inner work of self-realization is also the outer work of compassion. As one begins to accept the totality of their own being, a new spaciousness opens, room enough for the flaws of others, for their fears, their contradictions, their humanity. Love that flows from this self is not sentimental. It does not ignore the darkness in the name of harmony. It sees clearly, and in seeing does not flinch. It does not demand perfection, because it no longer seeks completion. It is not needy, because it is rooted. It is not anxious, because it is whole, and it is this kind of love that heals, not because it fixes, but because it embraces. This love is not reserved for relationships alone. It touches everything. It infuses the way one moves through the world, the way one listens, works, speaks, and even suffers. It brings a gentleness to life, not because life becomes easy, but because one is no longer resisting the truth of who they are. In this way, the self becomes the center from which all real love flows, not as an isolated island, but as a rooted tree, open to the sky, yet grounded in the earth. The branches may reach out, but the strength lies in the depth. When a person lives from this center, love ceases to be a transaction. It becomes a state of being, and so the question is not, how can I be loved? The question is, how can I return to that place within myself where love is already present? When that place is found, there is no longer any need to chase what one already is. Then, love ceases to be a search, it becomes a recognition. Therefore, I leave you with this. Seek not the love outside until you have unlocked the love within. Love yourself through all your shadows and splendors, and then watch as the world responds. Only when you understand this will you be truly loved.